Good morning and welcome to Rising. Emily is buzzing in from Vermont. Emily, welcome.
Hey, Ryan, it's good to see you. You may hear the gentle sounds of violin in the background. I think somebody's practicing for a wedding today in the room next door. So there's an added sort of charm to the show today.
It is definitely wedding season in Vermont. I'm glad you could be up there for it. So today we're going to start with the Senate passage last night of gun legislation, something that people thought was basically impossible. Bipartisan gun legislation. It was whittled down fairly significantly, but not so significantly that it doesn't include some provisions that Clarence Thomas and his friends on the Supreme Court might find to be unconstitutional, which we'll talk about in a moment. So let's run through what made it into the bill. So basically, people 21 and under are going to have enhanced background checks. Previously, before this law, well, now since it hasn't become law yet, the background check, the federal government basically has 3 days to conduct a background check. If they don't get it done in that amount of time, they then the owner is allowed to sell the weapon. This extends that to 10 days because they were so backlogged that often the background check couldn't get done in time. It closes what's called a boyfriend loophole, which says that if you're a domestic abuser, then you can have your gun rights kind of restricted if you've been convicted, even if you're not married to the person, and it provides funding for red flag laws, which are a place where people in the community can say, hey, this person's nuts. They might shoot up a school. Maybe we should make sure that they don't have a giant arsenal of weapons. Then it also provides a bunch of money for mental health and for school security. Which one of those you want to take first? What do you think is the most important?
Well, I think the most important is the federal funding for red flag laws. And I think, I did a radar on this a couple of weeks ago. I personally think there's little evidence that red flag laws stop mass shootings. I'm completely in favor of targeted red flag laws, but I think a problem, especially for those of us on the right, is that this is blanket funding for red flag laws. And there are some red flag laws that take away a Second Amendment right without due process. Now, if we want to get rid of the Second Amendment right, if that's the goal, then that's a different question. Of course, I don't agree with that, but you can't infringe on the right itself without due process. And I think that's a big problem with this bill. That said, I think the reason this bill passed, and I sort of think of it as legislative catharsis, I think that's the reason it passed is because it is pretty watered down to the point of being, almost innocuous. It's a lot of funding. I don't know, Ryan, what do you think about that? Well,
yeah, the right was up in arms, no pun intended, about this red flag provision, yet they came around in the end. So what did they do do you know what they did to those red flag laws to get the support of, what was it, 15 Republicans or so in the end?
They put a bunch of nonsense language in the bill in a very Senate Capitol Hill fashion that said we want to protect people's rights, we want to protect due process, and there should be penalties wherever that is infringed upon, which is just unenforceable. It's language, basically. So that's basically they fixed it with posturing and rhetoric, which again, if you disagree with the Second Amendment, that's a different question. But the due process part of it is genuinely tricky. And that's actually, I know we're going to talk about this later in the segment. That's exactly what happened in the Supreme Court decision that Justice Thomas wrote this week about New York's red flag laws. And I'll just quickly add, a red flag law existed in Buffalo and was not effectively used. There were, as we've talked about on the show, many red flags in Uvalde. It feels good. There's what one of my colleagues calls the do something caucus in Congress, and that's where you see this legislative catharsis come in. It feels good to do something, but I'm not confident that this is going to prevent tragedies.
I think just by itself, enhanced background checks for 21 and under and extending the background check to 10 days could that alone could save some amount of lives. But I think you're right that it doesn't really go, it's not going to upend the situation. There is one thing I wanted to flag that I hope that progressives in the House and also conservatives in the House take a look at when it goes through. So basically, there are two new elements of the law are being added to what's called the Title 18 of the U.S. Code, which is around straw purchasing, and basically adding these new crimes to what could be classified as racketeering. And when you get into racketeering, you can get into capital punishment. So I think people have to be very nervous in moments where everybody wants to quote unquote do something, that they don't accidentally do something that is going to have people wind up on death row for something that nobody really thinks anybody should be on death row for. And so because of the expansive nature of kind of racketeering laws and capital punishment in the United States, it can be easy to have slippery legislative language slip into those kind of draconian areas. And so I hope that they take a close look at that, because it's in nobody. I don't think it's in anybody's interest to try to make some of these cases capital cases.
That's a really good point to flag. And on a similar note, I think it's worth looking at the wording in the boyfriend loophole, the so-called boyfriend loophole language in this bill, which is very vague. And you can see that easily being used in ways that hurt innocent people and don't actually do. And again, I actually hope that the language is effective and it works, but it is really, really vague. And those do something moments are the ones that, they voted on this bill within a few hours of the text being released, which is as good of an indication as ever that they're trying to do something symbolic, that the particulars are just broadly diluted to the point that everyone's going to agree on it. But then you also never know what gets shoved into the bill. And this is one of those bills, I think, where that is absolutely of concern. And I mean, this country needs solutions. I just don't think this is one of them.
Well, I think one of the reasons that some of this gets so convoluted and you wind up with these weird situations where language is drifting into racketeering places is because the Supreme Court is increasingly carving out gigantic areas of gun regulations and saying that you just can't go here. So therefore, they end up then trying to have an impact on public safety and public health while fiddling at the edges. And if they fiddle too hard at the edges, they can end up breaking something weird. So you can't just have a rational conversation about this, which brings us to the Supreme Court decision in which Clarence Thomas and 5 other Republicans ruled that they're basically striking down New York's concealed carry law. And the reasoning, and help me understand how this isn't the craziest thing that I've ever heard in my life. The reasoning that Clarence Thomas lays out here is he says, look, you can only have a gun law that is constitutional if the gun law existed, at the beginning of the country, which there were barely any laws because Congress hadn't been set up yet to start passing laws, and if it was addressing kind of an issue that was a problem, in 1789. So unless it fits those things, then your gun law can't stand. And in the case, he even says, yeah, there were scattered gun laws in the late 18th century and in the 19th century, but those were just scattered gun laws. So you don't just have to have, you can't just say, well, look, okay, actually New York did do this, or actually Philadelphia did do this. Because then he'd say, well, that's not enough. Did everyone in the country do this immediately at the start of the country? And if not, then you can't pass these laws. And that feels to me an argument that legislation is unconstitutional, which that might be the thing that he believes, that fundamentally, all laws are somehow kind of restricting personal freedom, and that only what is in the Constitution, that's it, can't go beyond that. Congress can't pass laws, period. Congress shall make no law, just period. There is that, you see those bumper stickers. So why does that not just gut the ability of a democratic people to, democratically enact laws within a constitutional framework?
Well, I think that's a really interesting segue from the conversation we just had about the Senate bill, because a lot of the issue here is with the Second Amendment itself. I think there are a lot of people, I actually think the broad sort of perspective on the left about guns is kind of anti-Second Amendment in the sense that like the laws would say, and this is what Clarence Thomas is talking about, you can't put a burden on people to exercise what is a right. And so if you don't have a right enshrined constitutionally to bear arms, then, and it's just, your right, like your right to drink coffee, like I'm drinking right now, then you can place more burdens on it, right? The state can say you have to do X, Y, and Z to be able to do this. Whereas if it's something that's actually a right in the Constitution, that's what's at stake in New York. Whether you can carry in public, he's saying the state can't impose these burdens for you to be able to do what is a right. And so that to me gets to where the loggerheads is here, and that I think on the left, this idea that the right to bear arms is something fundamental that you have to have due process to take away. And that you can't impose those burdens. That is actually the problem in and of itself. And honestly, I understand that argument. I disagree with it, but I fully understand it because the levels of gun violence we have in this country, and I'm not talking just about mass shootings, every single day in our major cities, our suicide rate by gun, I understand, but it is there.
But it's only been since 2008 with Heller, the Washington D.C. law, where the Second Amendment was read that way by the Supreme Court. So it's not as if this is, some ancient tradition. I was old by the time, this was rewritten. Clarence Thomas and the rest of these justices have just ignored the part of the Second Amendment. They're like, you know what, this part that says a well-regulated militia being essential, we're just going to pretend that part isn't there, and we're going to rewrite this Second Amendment so that it fits our idea that it's all about individuals, has nothing to do with a well-regulated militia. Because if regulations are literally good regulations, a well-regulated militia, that's literally written into the Second Amendment, then regulations that well-regulate things should be not just constitutional but obvious and practically a requirement in order to so that people can really genuinely manifest these freedoms that are written into the Second Amendment.
Right, and I think what Thomas is doing in this decision is saying that there's a balance on the regulation, that if the regulatory burden shifts to the citizen and away from the government, then that's where the problem lies. And if you have something that's a right, a constitutional right, that's a different that has to be a different balance. So I think that's what he's saying. And Heller, I would argue, Heller is textualism and originalism, and that's just what Clarence Thomas is, and that's what this decision is too. Although I think you make a good point about the words well-regulated, but I don't think anyone would argue there should be no gun regulation, just that the burden should be on government to take away rather than the citizen to prove they can have that right.
We'll see about that, and I'll come back to poor grammar in the Second Amendment. But anyway, we'll tell you what's on our radars up next. Stick around for that.